Just very briefly, my name is Dr. Grace O'Keefe. I'm the editor of Archaeology Ireland. If you haven't yet examined your lovely tote bags, you will see that there is an issue, or a copy of the latest issue, with also one of the heritage guides. Just to very briefly go back to something Damien was mentioning earlier. He was saying about, in addition to his own Landscapes of Revolution, there is also a UCD project about the archaeology of revolution in East Limerick, and our spring edition this year, the Heritage Guide, was produced by the UCD project, and it's on the archaeology of revolution in East Limerick. So if you haven't got that copy, of course you should all be subscribing, but if you haven't got that copy, you can get it through the website, okay? So it's another way to follow up on it. Brilliant conference so far, and I think it's a really good example of why it's important to have conferences like this. It even just struck me what Jill was saying at the end of her paper about the opportunity maybe for teaming up with Damien and looking at pollen analysis of his finds. So this is how people get to hear about what each other are doing, and the opportunities for kind of new venues, you know, new paths of research. And also, you know, as Jill was saying as well, there's so much, I suppose, focus on interdisciplinary work, and this is how people who look at very specific areas within archaeology meet each other and get to see how their own work can kind of complement each other's research. So our first speaker for our last session today is Pádraig Ó Macháin, who's Professor of Modern Irish at University College Cork. He is the Principal Investigator on the brilliantly named Inks and Skins, which is a research project which looks at Irish text, Gaelic texts from around the year 1100 to around 1600. For anyone who has used, as I have, my own area would have used a lot of historical documents, so we would have been trained in kind of diplomatics and paleography, and how to look at a manuscript and kind of read it without even looking at the words as such, read the handwriting and read the paper that it's on, and to read how, you know, any marks on it, anything kind of identifying the time period. And this project kind of takes it down into the very core of the actual ink that's being used. So the research involves visual analysis, imaging, scanning, with the aim of understanding the composition of the inks and the pigments that are used by these secular scholars who are creating Gaelic texts, again, from around 1100 to around 1600. Again, it's interdisciplinary, it's a collaboration between humanities and sciences. The title of his paper, you can just, it's not come up yet, is the Spectroscopy and the Irish manuscript. So I would like you to welcome Pádraig, please.
Agus lu cháir orm bheithan san neomh agus am an bhaoich do úna agus do Sharon as a good hartam. Very pleased to be here today, and very grateful for and honoured by for the invitation that was extended to me. So, for some general remarks about Ireland's history of the handmade book. Most of you probably know this already. We have a continuous tradition in Ireland of manuscripts, making books from 600 AD to 1900. And within that timeline of 1300 years, three main periods of manuscript production are distinguished. First, the monastic period, from the introduction of Christianity, and with it the art of writing and bookcraft, down to about the end of the 12th century, which saw the production of mainly liturgical and scholastic books in Latin and some in Irish towards the end. And second, then we have the vernacular period of the professional secular schools of learning, writing in the Irish language mainly, and supported by the Gaelic lordships, from the reform of the Celtic Church and the arrival of the Normans in the 12th century until the collapse of Gaelic society early in the 17th century. And finally, then, we have the period of the non-professional part-time scholars, again, writing in Irish but much reduced in circumstances, who continued the tradition of preserving Gaelic literature in handmade books until the proliferation of the printed word in the Irish language at the end of the 19th century. The books produced during these periods were united in their use of insular, minuscule script, mostly, and distinguished by language, mainly Latin in period 1, mainly Irish in periods 2 and 3, and of course by the materiality of the writing supports, calfskin vellum, periods 1 and 2, and then after Kinsale, paper, 1900. The history of Irish language manuscripts hasn't been very happy. The survival of those books that were created during the medieval and late medieval the vellum periods, especially, has largely been due to chance and good luck. It's estimated that a total of 4,400 manuscripts containing the Irish language in whole or in part that survive today, only 400 of these are vellum books produced before 1600. For narrative manuscripts alone, it's suggested that the loss of books during that period was of the order of 80 to 90%. And there's no reason for thinking that the loss of other varieties of manuscript, history, poetry, law, medicine, science, was not of the same magnitude. While manuscripts were destroyed due to natural occurrences, plenty of records of that in the annals, it's thought that much of the loss took place in the late 16th century and through then into the 17th, the period when the English conquest of Ireland was prosecuted relentlessly to its final outcome. And this loss consisted mainly of destruction, but in addition, a significant number of manuscripts were taken into exile in continental Europe, where most of them were lost over time. Only a few survive, and less ever made it back to Ireland. Historical circumstances have left their marks on the surviving manuscripts in interesting ways, in the form of loss of leaves and physical damage, mainly staining and cockling from the effects of dampness and water, occasionally damaged by rodents. In addition, during the years and centuries after writing, the longer a manuscript remained outside of the confinement and relative safety of a library, the more additional material and external points of reference it accrued, usually in the form of marginal notes and additions, and consequently the greater is the personality of those manuscripts that slept rough, as it were, for centuries, and the more they have to tell us today. Any given manuscript will therefore over the years accumulate strata of information beyond which it was originally intended to contain, beyond its core texts, in other words. The extra textual information consists primarily of additions and modifications through pen and ink and on the pigment and so forth, but also encompasses physical marks left on the books by the passage of time and considerations of how manuscripts were bound or otherwise. And these marks are the obverse of the creation and preparation marks that are also to be seen on the leaves and pages, and that have something to say also. And it's the investigation of these small things that has occupied us for a few years now. In the case of the later paper tradition, just to mention it briefly, which in the quantity of manuscripts outnumbers those of the vellum tradition by 10 to 1, there are additional small things that attract investigation, and principal among those are the watermarks, particularly those in the early paper, as they can help us to define the interface between vellum and paper that began to appear towards the end of the 15th century and increasing thereafter when there was an absolute takeover of paper at the beginning of the 17th century. Capturing watermarks is a slow but pleasant task. Apart from satisfying the collector's impulse in those who have it, it can do two things. It can make a contribution to the discipline of the history of paper by providing dated examples of a particular mark, such as this rose, Tudor rose if you want, dated 1641 in the precious 22 leaves of the Irish language account of the rebellion of 1641, known as Cínle i Bhealláin. This is a second mark from the same manuscript of a post horn, a more common type of watermark. Paper, the advent of paper, was a defining moment in the history of the Irish book. And the novelty of the watermark is in its own way a symbol of the great change that was taking place. And it's the first small thing that we look for in the paper manuscript. In their vellum antecedents from 600 to 1600, we don't, of course, look for watermarks, but there are other marks that are of interest to us. Marks on the vellum that belong to the process of the creation and preparation of skin, as I mentioned, scrapes, holes, veins, repairs, and marks that are part of the writing process itself, prickings and rulings, inks and pigments, tracings, or indeed just the spaces that were left and never filled in, left for large initials. A feature shared with the later paper manuscripts, of course, is that many of these books will also carry scribal colophons and near contemporary or later marginalia that can provide important information about the book's history post-writing, and indeed during the centuries afterwards, prior to its accession in a library. The library, of course, being a concept foreign or at least very rare in Irish tradition. The word for library is a 19th century invention. Many of these marks on vellum manuscripts are visible in the first instance with the naked eye, others not so visible. For the recording and cataloguing of these features, as well as identifying some of the minutiae of paleography, the only technical aids that have been traditionally employed with a clear conscience have been a magnifying glass, the ultraviolet lamp, and also, though it hardly comes under the definition of technology, the handheld mirror reflecting natural light onto the page, a harmless methodology that is almost impossible to use nowadays when natural light is unavailable in so many special collection facilities. I mentioned a clear conscience because at one time popular methodology was the unconscionable one of the application of chemical reagent to bring up the text temporarily. A methodology developed in Germany in the 18th century, second half of the 18th century, and responsible for the obliteration of text and the corrosion of many manuscript leaves right into the 20th century, and in the case of Ireland up to the 1960s. Since then, we've had the digital revolution, and Irish manuscript studies have been to the fore in that regard. The digitization of Irish manuscripts in the late 1990s began as a collaboration between paleographical text and textual scholars at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, computer scientists in DCU, and pioneering digitizers in the Bodleian. And to 1998, I date my emigration from my comfort zone. And I have never been back. And that was close on 30 years ago. Since that time, and building on a collaborative experience, an awareness developed among some of us of other methodologies science had to offer. My own work has developed from that awareness, and in relatively recent times I've been lucky, because I'm not a scientist in any way, to collaborate with scientists in applying non-invasive technology that has been developed largely independent of the humanities in applying it to the Irish manuscript tradition to try to learn more about the materiality of these books. And for this, I've been very fortunate to enjoy collaborations with the Tyndall National Institute in Cork and with the Preservation and Research Department of the Library of Congress in Washington. The technology that we use is that of spectroscopy, accompanied and supported by microscopy where required. We use two types at the moment of spectroscopy in particular. The first is X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, XRF, carried out with a portable spectrometer. This uses an X-ray source to excite and cause subsequent emission within a target point on the page. The X-rays are absorbed by the sample, causing an electron in the atom's inner shells to be ejected, leading to the release of an X-ray fluorescent subatomic element that's specific to each atom, and allowing the spectrometer to identify the specific elemental composition of the target material. So we're talking about inorganic elements. Here we're examining the Stowe Missal, 8th century. Digitization can do so much, but it's not until you actually are in the presence of the manuscript that you get a feel for it, as it were. And that's the head of the XRF. It doesn't touch the page, but it comes quite close to it, and the reading for the particular point then emerges on as a graph on the computer screen. At the most basic level, XRF provides us with the necessary scientific confirmation of matters that have been subject to assumption heretofore. So we've speculated, and now we can prove it, particularly with regard to the ubiquity of iron and gall inks in medieval Irish manuscripts. A common service provided by XRF is the analysis of the material in the ruling, for example, whether it's lead or ink or dry point, or indeed in this case red pigment. It may confirm also through the absence of a reading the use of dry point, which is as common in Irish tradition as is the use of lead, and a practice that can vary from choir to choir and from scribe to scribe, and which, with the passage of time, may not always be visible. We can observe things like the differences between vellum and paper as writing supports. This is on the top there's the Nugent Duanada, or poem book of 1577, written on vellum, National Library. And below it is a transcript of the same manuscript made 50 years later or roughly 50 years later on paper. And you can observe the very low presence of calcium in the latter. Apart from giving readings of elemental composition of inks, pigments, or the writing support at any given point, a semi-quantitative analysis is possible based on the relative proportion of trace elements in the inks, generally copper or zinc, magnesium, lead sometimes. The relative proportion of the trace elements to the central element, which is iron. At a basic level, investigation of the trace elements can explain what we see with the naked eye, as here in a single manuscript. This is the Liber Primus Kilkenniensis, written between from the 14th century to the 16th century in many hands. Under visual inspection, the inks on these 3 pages present as brown, green, and black, respectively. XRF shows, and as is reported on the slide, the trace elements are absent in the first page that we're looking at. The ink is heavy with copper in the second and heavy with zinc in the third. We can also attempt ink profiles of entire manuscripts based on the same principle. Again, we're back at Stowe here, and someone mentioned Laura this morning, so I recognize the Stowe Missal. And the points of greatest interest to us in that manuscript are the juncture points between the excerpts from the Gospel of St. John and the proper of the Mass that follows it on 12 recto, and between those whole two sections together and the final folios in the manuscript, 65 to 67, which contain the tract on the Mass in Irish and famous Old Irish charms. This graph is based on a copper-iron ratio, and it shows strong readings with little significant variation throughout the manuscript, except for those closing folios. This isn't to say, however, definitively that the first two sections are in fact a unit. We can suggest that they are contemporary, and that's really as far as we can go at the moment. Because when we look at the decoration across both units, the first page on the left there is the opening page, the in principio page from John's Gospel. On the right there is the Peccavimus Domine of the ordinary of the Mass. When we look at those, we see a similarity in decoration with regard to the frame and the use of lozenge-shaped decoration. But in the analysis of pigments, we have orpiment yellow in both, but in the use of red, we have red lead on the left and organic reds so far unidentified on the right-hand page. In our analysis of other manuscripts, we've used clusters of related proportional readings, from which clusters it has been possible to identify the use of different ink over a period of time. In combination with other methodologies, traditional paleography and codicology, for example, we've been able to suggest a temporal sequence for the writing of a document. In recent times, using a combination of different softwares and procedures, we've ventured outside of our primary area of Irish manuscript research and used, at the request of the National Library, used this clustering methodology to support a hypothesis for the order of the writing of poems inscribed in an interleaved copy of an almanac printed in Dublin in 1666. We published that in Heritage Science last year. We've also used the clustering methodology on the great vellum manuscript from West Cork and now in UCC, the Book of Lismore, second half of the 15th century. In this case, we wanted to address the vexed question of the relative dates of the initial letters in the manuscript, as many have been considered to be 19th century editions all the way through. Using XRF, we took readings of the 15th century ink, we took readings of the 19th century editions that we know are 19th century editions, and compared the spectra with those of the 15th century ink. And then the inks of the 15th century and accompanying display script and text, they were all similar, but they differed from the 19th century inks by having more prominent peaks for zinc and small peaks for lead, as can be seen here. And with this control established, we then sampled the inks that we didn't know, the letters that were uncertain, and by a process of triangulation, which I don't pretend to understand, just in case, we were able to establish that the questionable inks aligned with those of the 15th century rather than with the 19th century, and so at the very least we could say that these are not 19th century editions. I mentioned these two studies to illustrate extended applications of XRF analysis. Our main work to date, however, has been concentrated simply on data acquisition, trying to establish ink and pigment profiles for the manuscripts that we have worked on, and in so doing laying down the beginnings of a database and of the use of these materials in Irish tradition. I should add that while Gaelic tradition has been and continues to be our main focus, we've also been looking at the parallel traditions that sometimes get forgotten, those of the municipal areas in the municipal records and the manuscripts produced in the post 12th century monasteries. A powerful spectroscopic methodology complementary to XRF is MSI, multispectral imaging. This is another non-invasive technique. It captures information at specific wavelengths along the spectrum, including those beyond visible light, infrared and ultraviolet. We have only been able to make limited use of this to date on some very prominent manuscripts, depending on the availability of our colleagues in the States to lend us the equipment and the expertise. But now, however, with new funding that we've just after sourcing, we only last week we bought our own MSI system, seen here being set up in Cork, and from which we hope for great things. What does MSI allow us to do? Image capture within and outside the visible range is a critical aspect of multispectral, and it contributes valuable information. Here, for example, is a page from Stowe showing the scrape marks on the vellum beneath the text on the left, and the violence involved in scraping the hair and flesh from the skin as part of the preparation. We can, in this case, we're looking at staining on one of the pages at the end of Stowe, one of the charms, with the staining removed to enhance legibility. This is the Book of Ivana, the same situation, heavy staining on the text in part, and we've been able to, MSI allows you to remove that and to read the text. The opportunities presented by the processing of the spectral images are great. Any combination of the multiple image captures can be combined and processed in various ways to enhance and reveal specific features not always visible to the naked eye. Just as another example, here is a formerly blank piece of column in the Book of Ivana, around 1390 in East Galway. So this was a blank place left, and then you can see later editions written in as happens, jottings entered subsequent to the writing of the main manuscript. And they include a series of calculations from the 18th century that only become visible under MSI analysis. In this type of analysis, advanced image processing is conducted using techniques such as principal component analysis, PCA. And differences within a data set can be detected and isolated with false colors assigned to each component to distinguish them visually and specifically. So we can tell, the scientists can tell through the software, can isolate. For example, in this case, we're looking at orpiment yellow throughout just a single page of Ivana. I should also mention that XRF and MSI support each other in ink segregation, and particularly in generic ink identification. Iron Gall ink, as I said, is the ubiquitous, omnipresent ink used throughout the Irish manuscript tradition. But Iron Gall ink will fade in the infrared, where carbon ink remains strong, and this has in fact helped us to identify the only manuscript that we have seen so far in the Irish tradition to be written in carbon ink. Here's another intriguing result from Ivana, a pen test occurring in the lower margins, as they do, or sometimes in the upper margins of this particular page. Testing the pen here. Pen tests like this are used to test both the quill and the ink prior to commencement of a stint of writing. MSI analysis of the page, however, suggests that no ink of the type used in this pen test is to be found on the page itself or anywhere in its vicinity. The possibility arises, therefore, that the ink was rejected for use, or that only the pen was being tested using a random ink, or maybe, which seems to me to be a possibility, that someone was using the margin of this manuscript to test his pen before writing another book entirely. Before concluding, I want to mention another spectroscopic technique that we have used to identify organic pigments in some of the manuscripts. This is fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, FORS, a technique that uses white light, a white light source and a spectrometer to create a spectrum consisting of a dip that is aligned to a wavelength specific to a particular organic material. This is the one piece of equipment that remains for us to get. I don't have any funding for a FORS system at the moment, but help of God, we'll get it, and then we'll have the complete kit. So what we're doing at the moment is we're marking with the XRF and now with the MSI areas that we need to investigate with FORS when we get that capability. We've had it on. We've had loans of FORS from Washington in the past. So this is just a taste of what spectroscopic analysis can do for the study of the Irish handmade book. It must be emphasized, however, that the scientific study of the materiality of Irish manuscripts using non-invasive technologies and instrumentation is just one process, one more way of looking at these artifacts, at these small things. And it must go hand in hand with traditional methodologies associated with the study of the book, and of course with the observation of the naked eye. The few hundred vellum manuscripts that survive today are storehouses of a multitude of features reflective of a particular Irish craftsmanship, which created the vehicles for the transmission and the preservation of the written word in Ireland. They exhibit diversity and continuity in the way that they were made and decorated. And probing these features further with the technologies that are now available to us can only add to our understanding of these extraordinary and unique artifacts of our medieval and late medieval heritage. Someday it is hoped we'll be in a position to sum up all these minute details into a coherent narrative, but for the moment we're still concerned with creating a critical mass of data for the vernacular manuscripts in particular from the late medieval period in Ireland. Emil Mahagat.
Thank you very much, Pádraig. I have a whole page of notes and questions taken from that. That's a really, really exciting project, and it allows so many possibilities for things like dating manuscripts and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, we'll get to that at question time.